So my name is Mandy Kellum-Sparaka, and I am the Student Support Coordinator in the Human Needs and Global Resources program. And we are grateful to have Dr. Mark Labberton with us at the start of our 2019 Fall Symposium in Human Needs and Global Resources. Dr. Labberton has served as the president of Fuller Theological Seminary since 2013. He's an author, a speaker, a teacher, committed to strengthening the intersection of the academy, the church, and culture, and doesn't shy away from many topics. Dr. Labberton earned his MDiv from Fuller and a PhD in theology from Cambridge. He has also served as associate professor and pastor for many years. His roles have also been in leadership with Scholar Leaders International, International Justice Mission, and John Stott Ministries, which is now Langham Partners, which is part of the connection we have with him now. It is through Dr. Labberton's book, The Dangerous Act of Loving Your Neighbor, Seeing Others Through the Eyes of Jesus, that he has become a common name in the Global Resources program. For the past 4 years, students have been invited to write reflections that make connections with what they read in Dr. Labberton's text and what they experience and learn during their summer break. This routine of integrating learning from text and context, from words and world, is fundamental to their preparation in the program and helps as they prepare for their internship, which is 6 months. Students have carried and read Dr. Labberton's book while engaging in life all over the world, in Vietnam, Italy, South Africa, Greece, Southern California, upstate New York, and in many other places. I'd like to share a few of the written reflections that have been shared with us over the years. One student observed, as I have been reading Labberton's book, his insights on our tendency to act as if service is not a problem has made me think about the ways I interact with customers at my work. I've been trying to respond to their thank yous kindly with "you're welcome," instead of course, or "no problem." Because I think it's very true that, as Labberton says, our lives are meant to carry and share in the problems of others. Our goal is not to keep the cost of love as low as possible. While working at a grocery store may not be the most exciting work for me, and it's actually very discouraging to think about how many plastic bags I go through, it has had good moments as well. One night I was closing, and a Spanish-speaking family came through with 2 whole carts of food and asked me a question in Spanish. Although I'm always nervous to speak Spanish to native speakers, I risked and was able to help answer the question and learned that they had just arrived from Mexico that day. I was so grateful that I was able to work that shift and was able to be there to answer their questions and welcome them to the States. Another student pointed out, Labberton challenges readers to think about who we consider to be the other. This has been important in my time of reflection. I would say the homeless community has been a group I have in the past considered to be other. Yet, serving alongside this ministry the past few months, I realize my favorite people here are the homeless, and the life circumstances I would have said creates the boundary between us, causing them to be the other, hasn't changed. These individuals are still homeless. I'm still a wealthy American, but they are not the other. Each person has a name. This has shown me the significance meeting simple needs can have and the importance of listening and genuinely hearing what people have to say. Taking the time to slow down and listen has helped build a bridge in my heart, connecting me with a group of people I previously considered to be vastly different from myself. It has been said of Dr. Labberton that he brings a deep desire to enact justice, love, and grace on both a global and local level. On behalf of my colleagues and students in the Human Needs and Global Resources program, we thank you for the contribution you generously and unknowingly have made to our learning community. You have shared a vision of how we are to enact justice, love, and grace within our program and beyond in the places we study, live, and work. And we are thankful that all of us gathered together can hear from you in this shared space this evening. If you would, please welcome Dr. Labberton with me.
Thank you. It's very, very nice. Well, it's really a great joy to be here, and I welcome any and every opportunity to be at Wheaton because it's a place that has shaped so many lives of people that I deeply love and respect, so that would be reason enough. But the hunger program within that has been one of the things that I have most admired in recent years about what's been happening here. In a very real sense, my life has been changed by some of the people involved in the hunger program at Wheaton, and they've certainly had a significant impact, again, on other people that I've known. Students that have graduated from here who have sometimes found their way to Fuller are, in some cases, students that have been part of the hunger program, and that has only continued this whole process. So I'm really, really genuinely honored by the invitation and thankful for the chance to be here. Also thankful for the chance to be part of this larger conference that's going to unfold over the next couple of days. I'm eager to stay for as much of it as I can and to benefit from the teaching and insights of others. So thank you for planning such a conference, and thank you those who are here. I want to dedicate what I'm going to say tonight to someone that I met on the very first trip that I took with John, which happened in that time to be a trip in part to Bangladesh. It was a young man about my age at the time whose name was Pradeep Dawa. And Pradeep and I had great adventures as a person who had grown up in Bangladesh and who had spent most of his life in Dhaka. He was able to take me in all kinds of places and to see and feel and smell and experience Dhaka in a way that I would never have been able to do on my own. I remembered him vividly. I wrote occasionally to him until that address went away, and I simply had no way of contacting him. Until suddenly, fast forward, 40 years or some enormously long period of time, when suddenly I arrive and begin as the president of Fuller Seminary, and I get an email from Pradeep Dawa, who is an online Fuller student in Dhaka, Bangladesh at that particular moment. And he had been working for many years with an organization called World Concern, which is based in the Northwest, and had been serving in Dhaka among very, very needy people for years and years. And he felt as though his leadership simply needed more education and development, which is why he was taking this course at Fuller. We had two opportunities to see one another, once on a seminar, and then I was able to hand him his diploma at graduation, which was just a really remarkable thing to me. And sadly, very unexpectedly, he had a heart attack this week and died. So in a certain very sad but also extremely sweet way, it feels so right to be here tonight thinking about the themes of this whole conference, thinking about John, thinking about Pradeep, thinking about the way that he brought into my life and into the lives of many people, people that I would not otherwise have ever had the privilege of knowing. And Pradeep is certainly one of those people that I treasure especially. So with that, let me jump into some of my reflections. When Laura and I were discussing what it is that I should talk about tonight, we decided that we would choose the title of John's book on preaching, Between Two Worlds, as the general frame. But really within that, it's actually an attempt to try to tell, from my perspective, the gospel in the life of John Stott. Clearly, no one but God knows what the gospel in the life of John Stott actually was. So let it be said that I'm not standing in for either John, let alone God. But secondly, let it be said that it's really a very personal story. And there are many people here tonight, faces I love and treasure, who knew John every bit as well or better than I did, and sometimes for longer than I did. And so therefore, I'm admitting in the context of those specialists that I'm coming to do something that really is very personal. It's not a hagiography. There is not an attempt in this to try to make him either more or less than he was. It's simply to try to describe the person that I actually discovered him to be. And as I've often said to people, one of the things that made such a difference about John is that often when we come to know people, especially well-known people, they become less impressive the more you know them. Whereas, in fact, for John, for me, it was the opposite. He became more impressive the more I knew of him. And that was really a remarkable and wonderful gift. But if he were here, he would first of all want me to sit down and stop talking about him when I even haven't begun doing that. And secondly, he would not want it to be very long, which is why I only have now 25 minutes left, so I have to go very, very quickly. So here are some reflections on what I understand to be the gospel in John Stott's life. Sorry. The first time I met John and had any encounter with him was, as it was for so many, an encounter at an Urbana conference. It was in the context of his speaking there and then attending a couple of the question and answer sessions afterwards that I was just so curious. How had such a person been formed? That was really my interest. How is a person like this actually formed? What were the factors? Through an unexpected set of circumstances, I had the opportunity later to then get to know him a bit when he was teaching a class at Regent College in British Columbia. And I remember again in the conversations that in that week or two that we had, asking him more questions about that and being even more curious about how it is that God would take a person who had been born into such an upper-class English family, who lived in a Georgian mansion on Harley Street in London, who could somehow find the reality of the gospel to so intersect with his life that he could actually be profoundly transformed, not just morally or spiritually or theologically or intellectually, but culturally. How could a person in the fine and esteemed and beautiful and exalted and elite culture into which he was born actually become a person who was so conformed to the image of Jesus over the course of his life? This is not a combination that I find common, and it's not a combination that I found even among his peers. Let me just share some of my own reflections. The first is this: the gospel lands in the life of somebody who is culturally privileged. This, I think, is a very important thing to be able to say, because it was a very privileged home. His father was a physician. He later became the head of the Royal College of Surgeons during the war. John himself and his siblings were sent to elite schools. He went to the rugby school. He was sent away at 8 years of age into a boarding school, a kind of classic, and for him, rather horrific vestige of Victorian England that he often spoke of with mostly resentment, that had actually been part of the culture into which he was born, and that he felt it had left a mark on him that he was not pleased about. It was in the context of that elite world that he then, through the good graces of an evangelist who worked for Scripture Union when he was 17 years old, eventually hears the gospel and becomes a Christian. And it's the beginning of a story of tremendous change. But I begin here to say it is a gospel that landed in a culturally privileged place. We may not consider ourselves part of the culturally privileged, and probably not all of us are, but many of us, enough of us are, that it's worthy of thinking about how it is that the gospel not only intersects our lives, but how it takes us in a new and different direction. And that, to me, is one of the most powerful things about his story. The next thing I would say about the gospel in John Stott's life is that it was Christ-centered. This, of course, is not just theologically true, but it's also really quite personally, transformatively true. It was true because the evangelist that led him to Christ is a man known affectionately as Bash. He worked, as I said, for Scripture Union. He was a person whose preaching focused really almost exclusively on the New Testament, and specifically on the person of Christ, because he believed that if you could touch 10 of the public schools, so-called public schools, which are private schools, the so-called 10 most esteemed and elite private schools in England for Christ, that you could change the face of England because every prime minister had come from one of those 10 schools. John was attending one of those schools. John, like so many other boys of his age, heard Bash preach. And it was the proclamation of this gospel out of this esteemed and privileged background, in the context of everything relating to the build-up toward and around and through the war and all of the things that go on during that period of time, that Bash, in 1938, preached a sermon based on Revelation 3:20 that begins, of course, with, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." And it was that sermon on that text that led John to actually come to a place where he was prepared to actually make a very deep and personal response to Christ. 50 years later, he put it this way: "Here then is the crucial question which we have been leading up to in the course of this talk. Have we ever opened our door to Christ? Have we ever actually invited him in?" This was exactly the question which I needed to have put to me. This is all part of the background of how the gospel affects him. For intellectually speaking, I had believed in Jesus all my life, but on the other side of the door. I had regularly struggled to say my prayers through the keyhole. I'd even pushed pennies under the door in a vain attempt to pacify him. I had been baptized, yes, and confirmed as well. I went to church, I read my Bible, had high ideals, and tried to be good and do good. But all the time, often without realizing it, I was actually holding Christ at arm's length and keeping him outside. I knew that to open the door might have momentous consequences. I am profoundly grateful to him for enabling me to open the door. Looking back now, over more than 50 years, I realize that that simple step has changed the entire direction, course, and quality of my life. Oh, that every disciple would be able to say that the way that we heard and understood and received and responded to the gospel ultimately transformed us entirely and thoroughly. Now, of course, like any disciple, John would say, the work is not yet done. Now it is, but it was not certainly then. There is an ongoing progression, but the depth and scope and range of this transformation is partly what I want you to reflect with me about tonight. This was not a gospel for a punctiliar kind of need or an occasional sort of anxiety or a hope about some kind of eternal life. It was a pervasive, gripping, transformative gospel. And this only built in the life of John Stott in part through the fact that the man who brought him to Christ, Bash, then wrote him every week for 5 years, discipling him. John kept all of these letters, as John would do. And I had the privilege of reading many of those letters. They were extraordinary letters of a discipling leadership, of helping a young man emerge into adulthood, trying to help him consider all of the implications of the gospel in any and every range of life. You couldn't possibly have imagined John Stott emerging at the age that he was by the time he had finished university, with the capacity to go on and do theological college without the kind of deep personal discipleship, which was another part of the way that his life was lived. It was really this sense of personal discipleship. Again, it is often said in studies that are done these days about the character of the American church especially, but I think the church around the world is a failure of discipleship, a failure to encourage or even name discipleship as a trajectory. Instead, faith is often just a kind of functional or religious element of life and culture. Clearly, in John's own experience, it's this deep Christ-centered sense that everything is about going deeper in Christ, wider in Christ, further in Christ. It's that kind of Christological center that drives really everything about how he sees the world. Jesus is not just a confessional affirmation for the sake of an individual conversion, but an entirely new window on all of reality. Now, Bash, this evangelist, was hardly what you would call a sophisticated theologian. That was not his style. It wasn't the kind of discipleship that he gave. But what was so penetrating to me was that there was nothing about life that was outside the bounds of the lordship of Jesus. That was a remarkable affirmation. And I think it gripped John. It was comprehensive enough to grab the mind and heart of a person whose intellectual capacities and mental abilities were so agile and so far-reaching in their skill and ability, their nimbleness. And it was really that became the core. So years later, John, among many other things that he's written, ends up writing a series of articles for CT, Christianity Today, on Christ the Cornerstone. And what was so interesting is that they've now gathered these into a collection of these essays, and I was asked to write a foreword to this little collection of essays. So I reread all of these essays. I don't remember how many there were, maybe 30 or 35 essays or something. But what was so remarkable about it to me was that they covered this amazing range of topics. He was just writing really out of whatever it was that he was thinking about at that particular period of time. And yet consistently across all of these various topics, there was this sort of penetrating concern for where does Jesus Christ instruct us, lead us, motivate us, inspire us, challenge us, reorder us, really just a very, very significant collection. Not because the topics themselves are so significant, because the profundity of the pervasiveness of faith across all of life was such a characteristic of his writing. I jumped ahead and already spoke about being personally discipled. So let me move on then and talk now about being biblically disciplined. He was never one to want to say either more or less than what he believed the scriptures actually taught. He wasn't a person that was trying to look for the text in order to hang something on it, nor to use it as an opportunity to jump from that text to some random concern in the world. He was always trying to knit together what is the actual text teaching us and what are the real connections to the world that we're a part of. And because he was so gripped by the sense that this was going to be more, not less, and that what it gave us was the kind of instruction that could change our mind and our perception and our orientation in the world, we would be different people if we allowed the rather covert work of the Bible to wonderfully pervade our way of thinking. I remember one of his favorite quotes was a long one that I'm not going to use, but it was a marvelous quote from Spurgeon where he talks about how the preacher should prod the text and poke the text and study the text and consume the text until eventually you lay down in the text and let the text soak into you until your very blood becomes bibline. That was Spurgeon, not John, but it could have been John. And the way that he used that text embodied this incredible sense of wanting his being to be pervaded by the scriptures. That's a kind of gospel understanding that I fear is often waning in our country and around the world. An experience, spontaneous and personal and intimate experience, often free from the Bible itself, is often too much a mark as the singular mark of the presence of God in many communities of faith. I'm just moved by how significantly his life was boundaried and disciplined by the Bible. Not as though it was a kind of straitjacket, but as though it was a staking out of terrain within which you would find your greatest freedom and your fullest humanity and your deepest love and your greatest compassion. It was out of that sort of spirit. So it was not a kind of doctrinaire approach to the Bible. It was not an approach to the Bible that suggested it could be separate from culture, which is why Between Two Worlds became the title of his book on preaching, in which the preacher should commit themselves to the text of the biblical world and the contemporary world and how these two things are brought together. And the preacher, but I could also argue, as he would argue, that it's really an act that any serious Christian is trying to do. How do we understand the connection between these two things? And how do we actively work at bringing them into meaningful conversation and transformation with one another? Well, he wrote on many subjects. I have to say, there was no tool or source from which he, of course, quoted more than the Bible. And it wasn't because of a kind of, again, wooden biblicism. It was actually believing I'm giving you the best food that I could give you. And if I'm going to serve you the best food, then it's going to be the food that is God's food through God's word that is meant to nourish and sustain us and change us. The next thing I want to say is that he was theologically integrated. This, I think, in part comes from Bash. I think it was in part, again, not his intention so much to be theologically integrated as much as this, that Bash lived out of an ordinary practiced sense that the gospel pertained to all of life. As John developed theologically, and as his theological education grew, as his own study and reflection grew, and then eventually, as his grasp of the greater world outside the world that he had been raised in such an elite context, suddenly it all begins to take different shape. You can imagine growing up in the early 20th century in an English context where colonial reality is still vividly around. It's going to be through the majority of his life that it will, or at least a very large section of his life, before colonialism actually begins to be truly dismantled. So the formation of the mindset of being English, and in that time and period, would be easily imaginable to see it only through colonial lines. I'll come back to this later. But what happens, I think, is that there's a kind of global sense of English culture that does pervade simply because of the colonies. But what happens for John because of his faith is that he comes to understand the one who is Lord, not just king or queen, as it were, but Lord. And the one who is Lord is the one who sees and knows the whole compass. And the one who sees and knows the whole compass rules without injustice, but only with justice, only with love and mercy, only with an understanding of the full integrity and value and dignity of human beings throughout the whole world. And I remember some long conversations with John about this sort of emerging decolonialized vision of the world that happened first because of the gospel itself, that it was for the whole world, which he admits at the beginning. He believes he saw it largely through colonial extensions of from the West to the rest. But over time, his vision begins to change, and it really begins to change partly through his writing, which then leads to invitations. So he's doing at one stage really quite a lot of speaking, especially at university missions, particularly after the publishing of Basic Christianity. And then he also understands that there's going to be an even greater engagement with the wider culture, as first along colonial lines, he was invited to various places in the world, which were naturally extensions of the culture and world in which English was primary. And in the context of that, it was possible to be able to believe that somehow those were going to be the lines. But then God mixes the whole thing up in this amazing way that I want us to think about. So to me, this picture of being theologically integrated, it's about a global reality. It's about every dimension of life. It's about what is both spiritual and physical. It's about what is near and what is far. It's about what's internal and what's public. There's really no dimension, again, which is cordoned off from the reality of the gospel. It would grieve him, especially perhaps, the statistic that was published recently that over 2 billion birds in the United States are gone that were here about a decade ago. Extraordinary. 29% of the total bird population. We'll come back to his ornithological interests later. So all of that, from the most ordinary and physical, the most systemic, begins to actually come into view. I think another factor in this is no doubt living in London, which especially in his childhood and early adulthood is clearly the dominating city of the world, really, in so many economic and political and social terms. Obviously, that all begins to change in the middle, late 20th century, but at the time that he's emerging as a young adult, that is still the center of so much of what's happening globally. And his question, as ultimately a rector in London, is, what do I make of the world if I'm a pastor in a setting like this? What's happening? It turns out that the parish he was raised in as a child is the parish that he then went on to serve. Harley Street is in the same parish as All Souls Church in London, and that parish is really, in some ways, has been, especially in the past, less so now, divided into two significantly different economic sections. One is really upper class, the other is really low to very low in some places, economics. And it's in that context that he starts his work first as a volunteer as a child, then he becomes a Christian, then he starts getting involved in various things that were going on in the youth club. And his bifurcation between leaving the Georgian mansion on the one hand and going into the neighborhood of such great need began to challenge his understanding of how does the gospel fit into this. Now, eventually, another factor comes along, which is the war starts. His father is the head of the Royal College of Surgeons during the war. John becomes convinced that his faith leads him to become a pacifist. Now imagine being a pacifist in the home of a father who is the head of the Royal College of Surgeons in the middle of World War II. And you are now all living in the same house, which they did for some of those years. And his father decided to not talk to him for at least a couple of years. Now imagine the impact, the formative impact of what it means to be a faithful disciple. It was clear to John from an early stage that if he was going to be a follower of Christ, it could bring him into complete collision with the very family and background that he had been able to benefit from, but was now having to completely reconsider in light of the meaning of being a follower of Jesus. This is a radical discipleship I think sometimes when you meet John, when one would meet John, his gracious manner and his English demeanor and the beauty of his voice and the gentleness of his spirit would hardly make one prone to think that radical discipleship would be the word that you would use to describe him. And yet at the core, there was this radical tenacity. It was a commitment. He eventually changes his view about that, and later in his life assumes a more just war position. But in that really critical young adult formation period, living in his parents' house with his father in this role, who is an agnostic and not supportive of John's faith or supportive of the things that John was doing, that calls for a new kind of integration. You either bifurcate, which many do, right, where we decide, well, really, I'll have a faith that is at home and another faith that is for my public life, or I'll create divisions that will subdivide in other ways. Somehow for John, there was this sense that, no, discipleship, the gospel of Jesus Christ, is a coherent whole. How do we hold all of this together? To me, that is a really quite remarkable story. He was not a clericalist, but he was somebody committed to education, thoughtful formation, and certainly theological formation for people of every role and service in society. So later, his interest in that, about theological comprehension being needed by the church at large, is not just about how do you train people for clergy or for standard, sort of as it were, Christian jobs, but for people in any dimension of life who simply need to let the teaching and authority of the scriptures pervade their life in all of its dimensions. It's an amazing and marvelous vision, and his writing, I think, captures that. Another quality I want to point out is that he's prayerfully grounded. You did not have to be with John very often before realizing that prayer would be a very important part of the discipline of your fellowship together. As one of his study assistants, I was particularly aware of the numbers of times when traveling together and in various circumstances where we would just be naturally brought together in prayer. There's this very amusing story, which I will not belabor, but it involves a trip by myself to India, to a very remote spot, to a camp that I eventually got to at 3 o'clock in the morning on my own through a wild set of circumstances. I'm eventually brought to the Quonset hut where John and I are going to be sharing. And a Quonset hut, has a concrete floor and then a metal roof, which resounds. And the guard would not let me in without being duly announced that I was coming in, even though it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was trying to explain to him that I was quite sure that John was asleep, that he had earplugs in, because that's what he always did, and that really it would be fine with me to go in and just find whatever bed I was supposed to be in. So anyway, he pounds on the door. That doesn't work, but it reverberates. And so lots of other people are now awake throughout the night. But eventually, I get in there, and he rouses a little bit. And then he did what I often saw when we were in a shared room, which is that his first gesture of getting up was to sort of pull his legs up so that his knees were under him. And that began for him a day that started in prayer. And seeing that visibly played out on all of the circumstances and places that we had opportunity to travel was for me a very moving thing. I think he's the only preacher I know who literally prepared sermons on his knees. Why is he so unique in that? So reason and argument and persuasion and pragmatism and strategy, all that mattered, but he was deeply convinced that prayer mattered above those things. I think another thing I want to quickly point out is just that he remained always ecclesially rooted. He never saw himself as an independent agent, even after he left All Souls. It could have been so easily imaginable that he would have just, as it were, gone out on his own. That just isn't his view. He was grounded in a community. He had a community of people to whom he was accountable. He was accountable to a board. He was accountable to a church. He was accountable to a rector. He was accountable to many. And he saw his life in that way. And yet it wasn't a clubby kind of ecclesiality. So All Souls was part of it, the Anglican Communion, for all of its problematical characteristics. Some of you may be aware of that. He was one of the people who was a leader in establishing the Evangelical Anglican Church, not as a separate denomination, controversially, but inside the Church of England. An amazing a story, and it's all part of being deeply committed to the church, not just his church, but to the church. So when he traveled and when he served, he wanted to be with the church. He wanted to serve the church. He wanted to understand what it would mean to serve the church. All those were things that I think are very significant. The next thing is that he was really rationally exacting. So many stories could be told about this. He was a man of reason with a very fine mind who wanted everyone else to be like him in that way. At least he gently and sometimes insistently and quietly, but rather always effectively, wanted to be sure that reason had been given its due place. Now, I think this is a very significant thing, and I would suppose perhaps for me it was one of the places that I found my greatest difference from John. Not that I'm not a believer in reason. I am, after all, the president of an educational institution that would like to think of itself as being committed to reason. So I am not here making a case against reason. It's really the trust that you have in reason. And I have less trust in rationality because I think it's less common than John did. And I think that rationality is wonderful when it appears, and it's less common than the reputation of reason would suggest. So, in any case, clarity, reasoned clarity, is one of the marks of his understanding of the gospel, one of the marks of his teaching, one of the marks of his writing. Extremely, extremely important. He was evangelistically committed. I've mentioned this, and I want to mention this as a quality of the gospel because he believed that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ should land in people's lives. And he believed that saving gospel was a transformative gospel, and that if it landed, it would make a claim on the whole of life. It was not a kind of thin-ended gospel with a tiny droplet of gospelness to be added to your otherwise unchanged life. Instead, it was this pervasive sense that, yes, we preach the gospel in season and out of season because we believe that, in fact, as we do so, it will be transformative. Let me just say that a particular story that has recently been very meaningful to me has been knowing John's side of the story about the article that was written by David Brooks a number of years ago in the New York Times entitled, "Who is John Stott?" David Brooks was able to write that story because a man named Michael Cromarty, who is no longer with us, was the person who led something called the Faith Angle Forum, which is a remarkable ministry to try to educate secular press about the evangelical church. So Michael Cromarty gave to David Brooks a set of books and said, if you're going to write about evangelicalism, this is the person that you should write about. And as a result, David Brooks read quite a number of John's books and then wrote a pretty remarkable summary of John's bearing and attitude and vision and commitment and so many things about his life. It was a tremendous thing. Now, as that happens, people are very excited for John, that John gets written about in the New York Times. If you knew John, you knew that did not interest him at all. That was like, whatever that could even mean, that isn't really the thing that got his attention. His question was, but what I want to know is, what about David Brooks? Where is he with Christ? So we had some exciting conversations together about where is he with Christ. And of course, I didn't know David Brooks, and I only knew the reputation of David Brooks, and I could only imagine what a New York Times columnist like David Brooks might think about someone like John, but the article was remarkable. So John writes to him and says, thank you for your kind article. I do get to New York sometimes, and if I do, would you be willing to meet with me or Washington, D.C.? I've forgotten exactly where that meeting happened. In any case, the moment comes. John has told a number of us that this is all happening, so we should pray for this meeting with David Brooks. Now, there was a kind of courage and assertiveness that John would bring to his evangelism that was really rather unqualified. So he did not come into this meeting with a kind of, I'll have an easy word with David Brooks about Jesus. That was not John's view. I have come to proclaim the gospel to David Brooks and to ask, where is he in your life? I remember thinking, I just think that's a little overwhelming. I'm not sure that's really the strategy. It just feels a little much to me. Really, like you're just going to go for the jugular on the first meeting? That just feels like, wow. But absolutely, that was what he was going to do. So I remember long conversations with John afterwards about how he thought it went. He described where he thought David Brooks was at that stage, personally, etc. Okay, that was the end of that story. Fast forward many, many years. I'm now in a setting where I've had multiple conversations with David Brooks. And one of the conversations that comes up in the course of it, because he introduces it, is he says, I understand that you knew John Stott. I'm thinking, let's not talk about that. Because I still didn't know what David Brooks at that moment actually made of the conversation. And I said, yeah. He said, I had lunch with him. Yeah, right, tell me about that. And what he told me was exactly what John had said. But what John would not have known, and I think did not know, is that the lunch turned out to be one of the things that in David Brooks' life, he would now say has been one of the most powerfully, spiritually impactful moments of his life. And the journey that David Brooks is on, which David would be the first to say is not finished, is a journey that was significantly influenced by the courage and tenacity of his evangelistic life. Another quality of John's gospel was that he was colonially repentant. I know that we're nearly at the end of our time, so I'm going to try to not jump these points, but I want to give them the weight that they deserve. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but as the cross, the center of John's Christology, grew in all of its implications, he became more and more aware of the way that the cross itself stood in judgment over any and every other form of power and authority. And as a consequence, it really meant reshaping the political, social architecture of the world that he had been nurtured in, the world that he had benefited from, but also the world which he now saw as being profoundly distorting to God's creation, bringing suffering and injustice and a pervasive sense of crisis to the world that was actually brought on by a Christian empire. And all of that in John's mind had to be deeply reconsidered in light of the more he thought about the significance of the cross of Christ that was putting all forms of death and injustice and sin to their end. I think it was really amazing. He could talk happily and readily about all the positive benefits that are sometimes pointed to about colonialism. But at the core, the critique eventually was the thing that actually gripped him, I would say, the most. He could name medical care, education, rule of law, et cetera, various things that are attributed often to colonial influence. And yet, the real thing underneath that was this incredible sense of sorrow. This was part of several conversations we had about his role as a chaplain to the Queen. There isn't time to go into that, but that was a very interesting part of the way that I think this unfolded in his life. The next thing is that he was relationally transformed. So he writes Basic Christianity. He is doing university missions in the Western world and then gradually in various places around the world. And then his relationships begin to actually completely undo his sociology. And he starts meeting people who have nothing in common with his privileged and elite background, even transformed within the context of England. He is remade by the people that he meets who are disciples in the majority world. These are people that, from his point of view, are actually the witness to the greatest evidences of the gospel in the 20th century. And this is a process of huge change because often people are so without resources and so without all the privilege that had shaped and guided his life. But now he's in a context where he's meeting people who are as intelligent as he is, who are as articulate as he is, but who are not privileged in the ways that he was privileged. And their circumstances and their vision of the world, their understanding of the gospel, the way that those two things come together and the way that that unravels a sociology of his own background then is a work that goes on really, I would say, through the rest of his life. This probably begins particularly in the 60s and 70s, and it then pervades the rest of his life. And certainly when I think about some of the people that I've heard John expound about the most, they are people who come from the majority world, whose life and vision and understanding of what it means to be a faithful disciple was absolutely remarkably different than the world that he had come from. And he gave his life, as many of you know, in part to travel and teaching and speaking and writing and scholarships and development and everything else, not for the sake of somehow being, as it were, from here to there, but providing resources that really allowed the voices of people in various settings to actually come to the fore, to be heard, to have the full credibility that they deserve to be given, but which had often, ironically and painfully, not been true of some parts of the evangelical movement. This is in part why Lausanne becomes such an incredibly significant turning point, and why the Lausanne Covenant becomes such a significant document, in part because of the way that these relationships of deep trust, of deep mutual respect, cause him, as one of the co-writers of the Lausanne Covenant, to simply say, I cannot write this document and offer this to a community of people that I know as disciples who are every bit as deserving of authority and voice in the church of the world and the church as I am. Their voices must be heard in this document. And some of the rub that happens inside the Lausanne movement, that Lausanne meeting, as well as frankly, other meetings even to today, there is this rub that comes through how much voice, how much authority, how much understanding will be given. Those are remarkable stories. And for John, they were defining stories. They were redefining stories that gave him a different vision of the world. I remember one time he was wanting to have a new camera to do some bird watching, and he was wandering around without any confidence that he could go and buy a new camera. And this seemed a little strange, not least because of his means, but also because it's not like he was going out to buy the world's most expensive camera. He just wanted a better camera. But John, by this stage, had certainly a very, very sensitive conscience about spending any money that could otherwise go to some other purpose. So the idea of spending, I think, eventually he bought a camera that was probably not more than a $500 camera, but you would have thought it was going to be a $50,000 camera. Why? Why would he struggle that way? He struggled that way because he saw and felt and understood the issues of poverty in a way that he had never understood before, and the accessibility that for him was just, as it were, a mere $500 for whom, when he knew now people whose whole lives could be changed by $500, right? It was just a radical disconnection and a very, very significant part of his own gospel transformation. And this leads to what perhaps could be called him becoming globally awakened, or really in contemporary language, it might be globally woke. His vision of the gospel and his friendship with the global church reset his social location. Now, this was the reason, actually, why I was most interested in working as his study assistant and why I wanted to understand how he had been formed. Because it was clear that he had come from a certain social universe, and now his life, his vision, his activity, but even more his heart and mind had been reset by deep friendships that extended out into the world at such a significant level that his own heart had been transformed by that. I remember just being so moved by the attentiveness. So John got, it always seemed, like about that many letters every day. That's another whole conversation about how the gospel calls us to respond to people. Let's just say it was always personal, and it was always hearing, and it was always listening, and it was always trying to be of some use. I think I would have thrown the letters away, but he didn't throw the letters away. And so many of them came from the majority world. and a place where his resources, personal resources, his own scholarship, his travel, his time, and now is extended in so many different ways through the incredible work that's going on through Chris Wright and through the Langham Partnership around the world, and the significance of scholarships that are being supported. And I'm so glad that all of that is tied in with what's happening here at Wheaton, and certainly Fuller benefits, as do other institutions, from the scholarship and the resources and the vision that was all part of resetting the terms. He would have wanted to reset global economic terms could he have been able to do that. Finally, let me close with this. He was ornithologically impassioned. This was, as anyone who knows anything about him knows, he traveled everywhere, and he always birdwatched wherever he went. It was always about birds. And I thought about saying ornithologically obsessed, but in John's personality, I'm sure he would not want to think he was obsessed. But to somebody who's not an ornithologically impassioned person, though he tried diligently to convert me and many others like me to that passion, I did learn a lot. I did learn a lot about paying attention to the world through John in every dimension. One perhaps final story. There was a time when John was away for a couple of weeks, and he was in the Middle East, and he was out for an early morning bird watching expedition, and this is in the United Arab Emirates, and he happened to see two really beautiful rose-ringed parakeets, which are birds about this big that are bright green and have a very bright red neckband. So he's following this pair of rose-ringed parakeets through the trees, and goes in through a passage which he doesn't really find himself aware that he'd even gone through. And he said, I only gradually became aware that there was someone shouting in the vicinity and that I was the shoutee. And he said, I lowered my binoculars, and standing in front of me was an extremely angry Muslim man who was screaming at me, get out of my garden. And John very calmly, this is back to his rational self, very calmly said, do you believe in Allah? And the man said, I do. John said, well, I believe in Allah too, and I do not believe that Allah would like you to be angry with me over appreciating what Allah has made. And he handed him the binoculars. So then the man takes the binoculars, he looks, and then the man said, you can go anywhere in my garden. I love that whole dynamic. Like that, I can't even think of anyone else who would have had that line at that moment, let alone have invited somebody into such a great and wonderful celebration of God's creation. These are just snapshots, in a way, 10-minute, too long snapshots. And let me just pause there and say that I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some of these reflections, and hope that those of you who know him, that this will stimulate your own reflections. And for those who don't know him, that you will be intrigued more to read what he's left behind and to take advantage of the incredible resources of life and faith and heart and mind that are the mark of the gospel in the life of John Stott. Let's give thanks. Lord, we celebrate with gratitude tonight a person whose gifts and life were simply made available to you. And in the context of that transformation, you have done great things. Here tonight are people whose whole lives have been changed in different ways by the impact of the gospel being allowed to land in one person's heart and mind in such a way that others are affected. The hunger program, the existence of Wheaton College, the purpose of this institution, the purpose of your church in this country and around the world is to be the evidence of the gospel. John was part of that evidence. We are to be part of that evidence. May, O God, it be so. For we ask it to your glory in Jesus' name. Amen.